As Melissa said, it's going to be a bit of a tag team, and I've invited Nigel to jump in and make comment when there's something I haven't elaborated sufficiently, and I'll do the same when he's talking. So this is the particular project that Nigel and I are part of in the CRC for water sensitive cities, and we're only 2 members of a much larger group, and there are 3 universities directly involved: University of Queensland, Monash and the University of Western Australia. And we're a team of about 10 people taking on various tasks, and we all contribute small amounts of our full academic load towards this project. A little background first. So my interest in infill, residential infill, really came about through some key government documents that were produced in Western Australia a few years back. Perth and Peel. Peel is the area to the south of Perth, and it's going to become a huge connected metropolis over the years of about 3.5 million people in 2050. Now, Perth has set what is the most modest target in Australia for residential infill of 47%. I know what yours is here, and we shrink in embarrassment at the 47%. However, of that 47%, we achieve only about 32 to 34%, and of that, 60% of it is still in the form of single residential. And I think one of the key reasons for that is that we are devoid, certainly in Perth, of real models, typological models of how to go about doing a form of medium to higher density residential infill that is of a sufficiently high quality, that doesn't disrupt existing communities in a damaging way, and that is sensitive to sustainability and water issues. So that really has helped inform the kind of work that I've been involved with for some years, and certainly the work that our D5.1 on the CRC is involved with. We are also faced with the fact that so many of the built examples are of such a poor quality that there is an understandable level of community resistance to higher density development. And this is a favourite example of mine. It's from a particular local government authority precinct in Western Australia. I won't name and shame them, but to their credit, they have now recognised that this kind of outcome is just appalling. However, it is compliant. This is entirely within the R codes, the residential codes that were established. And there were many, many examples built like this. So here we have a site which was a lot designated for medium density housing. And as you can see, it's been raised of any trees, any growth whatsoever. The only surface that you can see really is car park surface. The external areas for the houses are completely residual, utterly unusable. The level of solar gain and cross ventilation in these units is just appalling. So this results in what I'd call a kind of compressed suburbia, where the same kind of types, housing types, are being used, but they're simply pushed together, and all of the air and space is taken out of the site planning. And it's single story. There's a reluctance to go to 2-story there. And you can see all the other examples are the same. The only location where there is any existing greenery is in a retained single residential unit on its own block of land. And I have to say that that is not an orphan. There are many, many examples like that. And they're still being built, tragically. Now, I have read through your 30-year plan, and I doff my lid to the fact that you have an 85% ambition for residential infill, and from what I read, you're already achieving 76%. That's deeply impressive. And I wish that we could come close to that. You also talk about the need for new models of housing, and again, that kind of thinking is simply absent in the planning documents that have been produced so far in Western Australia. That is changing. We have some very good documents that are sitting in their draft state called Design WA, and they will, once they're made into law, change the way such housing can be produced over there. South Australia and New South Wales are leading the way in this area at the moment, and of course the New South Wales document, which came out last year in its draft form, followed the very good CEP 65 document, which changed the whole trajectory of apartment design quality in New South Wales. So they're now looking at doing the same for what they call the missing middle, a term we've all embraced willingly over the last few years. That middle, which is what is between the single residential and the apartment block, and a whole range of housing typologies that could sit within there. Some years ago, I was involved with Simon Anderson in putting this little booklet together for the Australian Institute of Architects. And the basic question was, how do we improve the current standard and opportunistic piecemeal suburban infill that's going on in our cities? And we invited 20-odd architects from around Australia to put forward propositions that demonstrated how design intelligence might actually affect this kind of higher density outcome. And I often refer to this single example as embodying a number of very good ambitions. And this is by Neeson Murcutt, Sydney-based firm that you may be familiar with. But what they were proposing in long existing sites in an area called 5 Dock was a tripling of the density. So this is the, can you all see if I, yeah. 3 smallish units, and again, we are still building the largest houses in the world. We're still up around 230 to 240 square metres average. So these are much smaller units, but with a degree of adaptability, flexibility built into them that allows a variety of different household types to take up residence in there. Some shared amenity out the front. You know, there's a group party or entertaining room. There's a dip pool, there's a workshop, and the argument is that with the increase of rates that is generated by this kind of 3 times densification, you would be looking towards a local authority to invest at least a portion of that additional return into a revamping of the public realm. So they're looking here at converting what is currently primarily a carrier of cars to crossovers to park into a form of linear park. All sorts of things happening along the street. Well planted out, lots of greenery with deep soil planting, water farming, that ambition that so many of us have but never seems achievable, which is sinking all of the utilities into a single services pit, so that you don't have to go digging up a street 17 times in 2 weeks to get access to all the different utilities. And you embed in these spaces, which now has a much narrower carriageway, a series of recreational opportunities. So it becomes a space in which people can engage with one another. It helps promote the idea of community. And that's a closer view of the houses themselves and that section of the street that it is able, through its increased rates revenue, to finance. And if you look closer at the units themselves, they're simple L-shaped courtyards. By incorporating another small courtyard at the rear, you increase a sense of volume and space internally. You increase the potential for airflow. There is a small upstairs space which can be used by children, a carer, a friend as a spare room. There's also, you can't see it unfortunately, a bench built in at this end which can convert to beds. So it's a house that has a degree of flexibility, as I said, that can accommodate a whole range of household types. And all of that comes through intelligent design thinking, focusing on how you might extract the maximum from what is in fact a very small area of house. Then when I was working in Victoria, I was really interested in exactly what was happening in the marketplace, looking back on what was happening in Western Australia, what was happening in the marketplace in Victoria in terms of infill in the middle ring suburbs, the Greyfield suburbs. And I was also interested in that question, if you started to apply, again, real design intelligence, what might you develop in response to what the market was doing? So my office commissioned the Monash group to take this on as a design research project, and this is where I hand over to Nigel to talk about exactly what they did do.
Here. So this is work that's done with the group called the Monash Architecture Studio, including colleagues Shane Murray, Diego Ramirez Lovering and Leanne Kaur. And as Geoffrey said, it started off by looking in the middle suburbs at what was happening and a kind of an experiment with could we do something better within the existing rules in a plausible way that would be doable. So we looked at suburbs, if you know Melbourne, like Essendon, around between 10 and 20 kilometres out of the city, and looked at these typical dual and triple occupancy developments. You can see there's the buildings behind each other. Whoa. 3 in a row and 2 side by side and 3 side by side. And a common factor in all of them were that the open space and the distribution, because they're primarily single story with some 2-story elements, was fairly congested, like the Western Australian examples Geoffrey showed, and also really determined all these ins and outs. The more we looked into why are they like this, it's determined by car turning circle regulations, and all the rules that apply to getting vehicles in and out of the site had much more influence on the way the buildings ended up than any idea of what would be a good space or how would be the best way of arranging 2 or 3 buildings on the site. So then when we found another type was 2 lots that were joined together, you could have a central driveway coming in with, say, one building access the front, other buildings all with engaged garages. And you can see this dark grey tone showing the area just not for cars to park, but for cars just to get in and out into these garages. And the hatched areas, which are the living spaces, are all pushed to the periphery and kind of secondary in the design hierarchy. So we tried to understand the typical scenarios in order that we could come up with some strategies that would be replicable, not just in one site, but across all of these inner Melbourne suburbs. And we did a lot of research in working out what were the type of block sizes, because the actual dimension has a big impact on what's possible. So if you've got a block that's 15 metres wide compared to 18 metres wide, that makes quite a big difference if you're looking at off-boundary construction, which we were assuming here because it's a suburban situation. And this is an aerial photograph of Essendon, just showing the number of sites in a kind of 5 to 10 year period that are turning over. So even though there's no particular strategic design, urban design vision for the suburb is changing quite a lot, and each one of these sites involves demolishing trees, reducing the overall canopy cover, affecting the kind of biodiversity and overall sustainable performance of the suburb. So, and it continues and continues, and we're kind of using up the opportunity of houses reaching the end of their lifetime and transitioning into another 50-year period. So the design objectives set at the brief from the Victorian Government architect were to look at a 3-for-1 dwelling replacement ratio as a base case. Working within, Res Code is already a bit out of date, but within the current envelope controls of overshadowing and overlooking, so we didn't have to rewrite the rule book to achieve it. And part of that is minimising overshadowing and overlooking, which are typically in those developments achieved by putting big screens in front of decks and balconies, which makes them feel even worse. Having a 1 car per dwelling ratio as a baseline, and we'll talk a little bit more about future transitioning of car spaces, which are taking up a lot of the space of our suburbs. Optimising passive design strategies, providing ground floor access to all dwellings, so we're not looking at apartment typologies in this particular study. Viable construction techniques with potential for innovation, so things that could be simply constructed within the non-commercial building companies, so not needing cranes and other apartment scale technology. Very importantly, providing usable private outdoor space and preserving key aspects of suburban character, which has a lot to do with the landscape character. So that means smaller footprint buildings, essentially, to leave more space for deep root trees, providing share use space and allowing adaptability. And we felt that and this is all this work is kind of pre-design, it's more strategy planning. We thought we really had to rethink about the nature of the house itself. And as a starting point, we looked at an idea of large rooms that were all within conventional structural spans that were large enough to be used as a flexible space or subdivided, and the report goes into detail about how these can be subdivided into bedrooms for different family and household types. Each of these rooms is linked to supported by a services core of wet areas and distributing those wet areas throughout the building, and importantly linked to private outdoor spaces or open spaces. So the diagram up here shows the green is a covered outdoor space, a large volume courtyard type garden space and a raised terrace space, and the white behind it is the built volume, and thinking how each of those internal built spaces relates to an equivalent outdoor space, and to give the sort of positive and negative equal emphasis. We also wanted to think about a small and affordable dwelling that could easily be expanded. So we think about future adaptation that within the current envelope controls, you could add another story on top by extending the core, or we could infill certain areas. So there was a lot of work backing this up about how household structures are changing and how we might need different arrangements of flexible spaces that could change use over their lifetime. They might start off as a bedroom and turn into a living space, for example, but all of this is possible here. And then we looked at applying this to a series of typical sites in combinations of 2 and 3. So 2 back to back, 2 side to side, and 3 in a row. And in the process of doing that, we can think about other objectives, such as increased permeability in the suburban block at both a visual, a tree canopy level and a pedestrian level. And this first model, which is an application of that base unit across a linear site, extends a bit of the thinking of that Neeson-Murcutt 5-dock scheme, but across 2 sites where you can join one street to the other, and achieves 3 dwellings on each site, but leaves, importantly, a quarter of the site as open space. And you can see that all the buildings are off the boundary. They all are arranged around a well-oriented courtyard, and they provide good privacy and a sense of communal shared space. The volume, the potential 3-storey volume, is located in the centre of the suburban site, so it has minimal impact on neighbours. And this red line is the Victorian envelope control at the time we did this study for a typical suburban growth zone, and it deals with overshadowing and overlooking. And this series of plans show how the strategy for dealing with vehicles. So we started off with this idea of 1 car space per dwelling that had the potential to either be located in a carport situation as a drop-off, or in this communal open space in the middle. And then the next phase of that would be that we'd say, well, these undercroft spaces are no longer able to be parked in. They might be used as a covered living space, or indeed filled in as a room, and therefore the cars get restricted to coming into the site to this point on both sides, and the cars are parked in the communal area. And the eventual outcome might be that the cars are switched to more of a share car scenario, or there's less parking provided on the site, and it could be a flexi car, share car, or an electric car that's teamed up with changes in the streetscape, and that central space is given over to communal open amenities such as vegetable gardens or indeed guest spaces. The project, as I said, looked at back-to-back, side-to-side and 3 in a row examples, and quite a lot of work went into the dimensional properties of those. The yields, just to show the 3 models in a row, there was the linear L-type one, what we called a mansion type, which had a larger building at the front and smaller buildings at the back, that got 6 to 7 dwellings over 2 sites, and the cluster type over 3 sites, where a more complex arrangement of courtyards and access to the individual variants of this basic room and core model were applied. And when you look at the cross-section through that cluster type, you can see the kind of grain and intricate density that's achieved at a two-level plus roof terrace type scale in relation to existing buildings. It's not a kind of threatening scale. It's quite a lot of open space and greenery, and cars can be included in the site, or they could gradually transition. So it's a porous, small footprint model. And that project got us thinking about if you took that thinking on each individual sites and took the scale of development that was turning over in these suburbs, could you think of that as not 8 or 10 different projects, but more strategically as one project that evolved and was implemented in stages? And if you did that, then some of those through paths that we were trying to implement in the back-to-back one, or the courtyard spaces, could join together and create additional urban design development, urban design benefits that could get us past the totally atomized nature of every lot being its own island within the suburban fabric. And that led to another project which was done under the funding of AHURI, Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, which looked particularly at public housing land holdings. Again, in similar suburban areas, houses in the so-called grey fields, which are reaching the end of their useful life. They were all had maintenance issues and were looked by the Housing Authority to be redeveloped and to be made more into dwellings that were more suited to the current demographic needs. And typically, small houses on fairly big lots, underperforming environmentally and in need of refurbishment. And we did some analysis and looked at, this is quite specific to the public land holdings of the area, but we looked at all the little yellow dots are all the, at the time of this study, which was about 2013, all the government-owned land across Melbourne, and tried to identify which ones, there was 20,000 total allotments, which ones could be used strategically to kickstart a transition of these middle suburbs, and could government be a catalyst agent or a transforming agent that could lead the private sector and give examples of how individual allotments could join up into a more comprehensive precinct-based approach to suburban development. Part of that, this graph shows the same land holdings in relation to land values. So over time, since the founding of these original housing estates and their original selling off, the land values have shifted in Melbourne, so some of these allotments are worth a lot more than others. And we had an argument about cross-subsidising development. If you thought of it at a whole metropolitan level, could you cross-subsidise development in less valuable areas from that in more valuable areas? The middle condition here shows the typical pattern that we observe, which is a kind of disaggregated clustering of 1, 2 and 3 allotments joined together. So the yellow dots were all in these groups of quite close together because they were a previous conjoined housing estate that had been sold off or privatised but not completely. And that had an interesting kind of potential energy for change of the green area here when compared to completely individual allotments or a kind of more consolidated development, which is potentially typically more attractive to developers, but can be seen as an island or ghetto even. So this is two study areas. One was in Reservoir. The yellow shows the current public housing ownership. And then we looked at, within that, some sites have more value than others. And could we use these allotments to open up connections and create not only good housing outcomes, but good connectivity, open space, functional servicing and water sensitive features and so on. And in the other one in Hampton, which was the higher value suburb, a similar scattered landholding could be strategically used to join up existing open space amenity, all these sports fields, into a network of that could support a higher density, a network of open space that was already there. So making the existing amenity work harder. And that was developed into some test scenarios of 12 allotments. So there was 12 of these yellow sites thought of as one development. This one where there's a street that could join these two ovals together, and it could support higher density models that in a piecemeal way transform the streetscape over time, with the idea that the white private sites might follow the lead of the public sector here. Or we could target existing infrastructure such as strip shops that had closed down and use that different grain and typology in conjunction with the government-owned land to make a network of paths that are activated and created a different grain through the suburb, connected to transport and so forth, and open space. Or look at such things as this, which is all over Melbourne, and I'm sure most Australian cities, big park areas that are fairly underused and have blank frontages. Could the allotments that face such a park be redeveloped in a way that they also open up access and increase the use of these spaces and allow water drainage to be coordinated and so forth, and connect to retirement areas and all these other fringe benefits of densifying that maybe the densifying could allow and financially support wider objectives for the community. Importantly, we ran a design studio and tried to have a community consultation process as part of this, because we realised that for such a suburban precinct transformation, you really have to involve everyone, like the people, the social housing tenants and the other tenants and the local authorities and so forth. So we had students work to visualise kind of before and after scenarios of the park edge, and took these design propositions and collages and so forth to the community and with models and talked through what kind of change might be acceptable to it, and how could the community get on board with the transformation of their suburb rather than have it just happen to them in a passive way. Because, as I said before, these suburbs are all changing and they're being developed in ways that most people don't like. They either don't like them because we can see analytically that they're not performing well, or they just don't like them because they feel mean and the parking is a problem and all those usual suburban issues. But we found that by talking at it more as an opportunity, right, the change is an opportunity for getting things that they don't currently have, we could put a positive spin on it and allow people to have a say. And three of the things that we found out of that process were that actually a design-led process where we could show opportunities for transformation and ask people to respond and engage with those can overcome a resistance to development by letting it be a more positive process where there's a chance to have a voice. The second point is that people were not, in our two case study consultations, were not necessarily averse to development per se, but they were sick of development that just took away amenity and didn't give something back. So if we could show that higher density and more people could allow the suburbs to have shops that were open, or small meeting spaces, or community facilities that they didn't currently have, that would be a positive outcome. And sticking points such as parking, overshadowing and overlooking, which were all common objections in middle density, middle suburban development, could be overcome by thinking about how they could careful siting and where could height be accommodated, or where is a good place to put a volume, rather than having blanket height limits and saying we don't want any development over 2 stories full stop. So we found it to be a very open process and understood as a community engaged transition process that might unfold over, say, 20 years, rather than a yes or no to a single development outcome.
Thank you.
Over to you.
Thanks, Nigel. It's probably worth also adding that that initial project that was done, Infill Opportunities, is freely available for downloading on the website of the Victorian Office of Victorian Government Architect. So if you put in OVGA Infill Opportunities, you'll find it.
Geoffrey will send a link out with the proceedings of this event.
Thank you, Melissa. And what Nigel covered in it was really just a brief introduction to the level of thinking that has gone into that document. So I'd strongly recommend it. Okay, when Nigel came to give a paper to a housing conference in Perth, when was it, the end of 2015, I took the opportunity to introduce him to the Director General of the Housing Authority in WA to talk about the work that he'd done with that Office of Housing in those sites like Reservoir, because I could see that there was real potential for application in Perth. And the Director General got it instantly and said, right, we need to implement a project like this, and we need to set it up as a replicable process that we can use in other areas that are owned by the Housing Authority. So, City of Perth, Perth Airport, domestic airport. This area is undergoing dramatic change at the moment. There's a new underground metro line that will come through and service this domestic airport and the international airport, which is located about here. The domestic airport will in fact also be international, in as much as the new Qantas Dreamliner that will be flying direct from Perth to London, no stops, will in fact take off from here. So you'll fly in as a Qantas domestic passenger and you'll be able to go straight to the international connection, and off you go. So this is a quite important new strategic area of redevelopment. So the train station will be around here, and high density residential around it. The Housing Authority's holdings are in this area, which is Redcliffe, and you can see it's really strategically well located. It's very near the river. You can pedal to the river in just a few minutes, and there's a lot of recreational opportunities around the river. And it's very close to the city, very close to the airport. So it's going to become very high value land on which we now have some housing which is well and truly beyond its use by date, some that is not, but that will be a staged development that occurs. It's another image of Redcliffe. Redcliffe is in fact bisected by a large industrial estate. I can't see that going in the near future, but eventually it will go, because again the value of the land will outstrip what's on there. So this is the particular pocket of Redcliffe that we were asked to look at, and the yellow blocks are the holdings by the Housing Authority. And you can see that some of them are entirely contiguous and others are spotted through the broader precinct. We were asked to look first at this particular area, and it provided some good opportunities based on the work that the Monash crew had done previously, and based also on some of those ideas that came out of the Take 7 Merkert-Neeson proposition. So what we were looking at was the potential of converting this street, which links from what is a major freeway, the Tonkin Highway through here, and there's a bridge over the freeway there, back to a small local set of shops, but also links back to what will become the underground train station on this side of the highway, with all of its higher residential development around it. This shows it in a little more detail. And the suggestion was that this become the linear street, the linear park that we had described earlier with the Merkert-Neeson project. Obviously still enabling local traffic to move through, but quietening that traffic down by using the street for other purposes. It becomes a shared street. All of these blocks we're looking at replacing existing housing, whereas the blocks at the end here, the housing blocks, are on land that is currently undeveloped. This was stage one of the project. Stage two is in fact taking the type that we generated and developing it for this site. We're in fact assuming the role of master planners, and the plan is to commission 3 or 4 local architectural practices to develop the particular types for that site. We've always argued that the single typology that we developed here was just an example of, rather than the answer to, because there are numerous strategies that can be adopted, but we thought that this one did in fact embody a number of principles that we are keen to make consistent in terms of this kind of development. So we looked at a base model that would sit ideally across 2 sites, but it could also sit across sites that were amalgamated beyond the 2. It could also sit on a single site if need be. We tended to try and put the bulk of the development towards the centre of the site. So again, you weren't impinging unreasonably on neighbouring housing, and we were also conscious of maintaining privacy for those neighbouring houses. And we established 10 design principles. Rather than me go through each one of them here, Melissa, you'll have this available to attendees? Okay. But very quickly, we thought it was important to have within the complex a mix of dwelling types. So there is a real lack of diversity that's available in the marketplace at the moment. We were concerned that there be a true mix of types. We were looking at achieving a minimum of a 3 times density improvement. We were, as I said, looking at controlling scale so that it did not become something that was overwhelming to the existing context. We were very conscious about how so much medium density in terms of apartments uses gallery access or corridor access, which inhibits a whole lot of good design outcomes that you may otherwise wish to achieve. One clearly is privacy. Another one is when you've got a double-loaded corridor, cross ventilation becomes impossible. Access to solar gain also becomes difficult. So we worked with the stair hall typology, where you have a central stair hall which gives you access at each landing to a number of units. That allowed us to maximise the exposure of each unit, which would in turn have at least 2 external walls to sunshine and to fresh air. What else should I mention? We did provide some shared amenity. We suggested that the rooftop could become a place for productive gardens, and potentially, if that group was willing, to entertain the possibility of a shared laundry or even a shared kitchen for the purpose of entertaining guests. So your own kitchen would be a fairly modest affair. Obviously you could cater perfectly happily for a small family, but if you had an extended family occasion, you'd go up on the roof, you'd book it out, and that would be your time slot. We thought it was important to have deep root zones throughout so that you encourage large canopy trees. And again, going back to that Neeson-Murcutt example, we suggested that the densification should be reflected in an enhanced public realm. Quality of open space, quality of recreational opportunities had to go hand in hand with an increased density. One car parking space per dwelling was what we agreed would be the maximum. We didn't quite achieve that with some of the sites that we're looking at, and that's going to be an interesting battle when we go to the local authority and argue about car parking, who see that as one of their major problems to be overcome. Not just the provision of car parking bays, but also their covering, so they don't have leaves dropped on them or have birds to spoil them. But it is an issue. There is a cultural issue about protecting our cars. So this gives an indication of, with the white forms, what we were proposing in terms of the new development. The site that we're looking at was also originally largely swamp, and there were market gardens through here. So we have some interesting water issues to deal with, which ties back to our D5.1 interests and commitments. And we're looking to see how the presence of close to the surface water there can help enhance the public realm. So this was the type that we did develop. So here's the footprint, where you've got the hallway with access to stairs and a lift. You've got a driveway that goes up in a single direction and out in a single direction back onto the street, and a parking area with a permeable surface. And you have courtyards, which allow deep root planting. Then you see the stair hall in the centre of the building. These again, like the work that Monash did for infill opportunities, are diagrammatic. They are not developed designs. That is the next stage of the project, which we're now engaged with. And the project goes up 2 stories to the street, 3rd story set back, so it's, in terms of scale, less of an imposition on the street, and a shared amenity at the rear. So the rear building is kept lower. And this shows the various plans at this very diagrammatic level. And it shows that you've got different unit sizes according to different needs. And some of these spaces could be amalgamated so that you get quite different unit types throughout. And the shared amenity on the roof with the productive garden, the shared kitchen and potentially shared laundry. And that top section demonstrates the scale relationship between the existing neighbourhood housing form and what is proposed. We have different site configurations. This was a corner site which allowed a straight through road to go through the site as against the U-shaped road on the other example that I showed. So we were looking at a range of different siting opportunities. We also looked at some very basic form studies. Again, these are diagrams, just looking at where major openings might sit and how you might configure corners so that as a building hit a corner, you either would increase the scale or reduce the scale, depending on the particular context in which it sat. And we looked again at the public realm. Still diagrammatic, but we now have the opportunity to take this further. So this is the site that we're currently looking at. We have 4 existing residences which will remain, and we have a quite large site. Do you recall the area?
No, but there's about 110 dwellings.
About 110 to 120 dwellings, depending on final configuration, and they'll vary between 3, 4 and 5 stories, depending on where they're located on the site. The freeway is just up here, so there will be no development to the north impeding it, and the views to the northeast in particular are quite spectacular as they look out over the airport to the Perth Hills. So there are some good opportunities on this site, and we're testing issues like car parking. You know, what is it going to cost if we go to half basements? If we put them all on the surface, what are the implications in terms of using up what is some very good surface area? And there is a collection of extremely good trees on the site, and we've had an arborist go through and tag all of those, and we'll be responding to their presence.
I think that's important to say that this site, the housing authorities agreed that key objective should be to retain all the significant trees, the jarrah trees, whereas the typical baseline Perth style development is bench everything and demolish all the trees and set a level block. So that's a big buy-in from the housing authority.
It is, and topographically it's not a great there's not a huge variation across this site. It falls across in this direction. These were the initial propositions that we put forward as part of that first stage 1 submission, which we are now developing. So it is using the single type that we developed, and our plan would be that coming out of the engagement with other architectural offices in Perth, that from the principles that we put in place, we develop additional housing types, so that we end up from this project with maybe 4 or 5 different typologies that again become applicable in the marketplace. This demonstrates the yield outcomes from the various sites that we're looking at. So you can see number of existing sites, 9 units, and the density in dwellings per hectare that came out of it. You can see 9 for 9 car bays to units, 27, and we fall behind a little bit here on the big site, the big consolidated site. But again, we're looking at what is possible there. The local authority was not all that interested in engaging with what is happening with car usage in other parts of the world, where it's rapidly dropping off, where individual car ownership is diminishing, where share car use is increasing at a considerable rate. That's understandable. They'll be under pressure from their ratepayers to ensure that that level of amenity is maintained. And we thought we'd finish with just a couple of examples locally in Western Australia of some medium density development that are using typologies that enable a degree of adaptability, flexibility within the planning. They're very much responses to local building conditions, using local materials and local cultural expectations. This is a little courtyard house project developed by Officer Woods in Whitegum Valley, which is just to the east of the town of Fremantle, which for those who don't know is the port of Perth, a little like Port Adelaide. So these shots demonstrate what the nature of the courtyard is, and they've used locally developed materials in rammed limestone and frame construction sheeted in the main corrugated iron. But what's interesting is in the planning, and it shows up better in these plans, the variations that can occur within the single perimeter. So you can get a variety of, again, household types within that single perimeter, and some of the units go up to 2 stories to give that variety even more richness and diversity. So multi-generational, where you could have 2 kitchens. The houses are certainly big enough to accommodate that degree of flexibility. The courtyards are all oriented to the north, so that you are able to saturate the courtyard itself with trapped sun, and the spaces are small enough to be able to be water conscious in the way they're planted out. And the courtyard, I think, is a type that we need to develop much further here in Australia. Its potential is huge. A number of houses were designed with courtyards in the 50s and 60s, but that particular experiment never developed very far. And of course, every square metre of space there is usable, rather than all the residual space that is left around a normal residential development. Another project which is not very far from that one, this is Knutsford, again just on the eastern edge of Fremantle, designed by a practice with the name of Space Agency, and with this project they won the Multi-Residential Award in the Institute of Architects nationally last year. Again, using local materials, even to the point of the local tubular steel pergolas that many of the Italian community use in Fremantle for pergola type structures. But what is interesting about this project again is the degree of flexibility that is allowed for in the planning. And this demonstrates, for example, on the ground floor, This is the range of terrace houses that they use in here. On the ground floor, this major room here could be used as a living room, table tennis room, a bedroom and a study, a kitchen and a dining room as a downstairs flip to the otherwise normal pattern. So upstairs you do get the living space, the kitchen, the dining, and an outdoor deck with views out in that direction. This particular unit looks out over their own courtyard, and over the garage is a small studio apartment, so that you're densifying again with a variety of housing types. And that's it. So, thank you very much.